Good morning, good afternoon to our audience members joining us from various time zones. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. Thank you for joining the second day of AGSIW's Petro Diplomacy Conference, our seventh annual conference this year. Today's session is titled The Role of Gas and Renewable Power Generation in a Carbon-Constricted World. And we have a stellar group of experts joining us to help us take a deep dive into these topics. I will briefly introduce them here and share their full bios in the chat as usual. First, I'd like to welcome Anne-Sophie Corbeau, the Global Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Her research focuses on hydrogen and natural gas with over 20 years of experience in the energy industry as a recognized expert on gas. She is the author of many publications focusing on gas, liquefied natural gas, markets, Asia, China, India, and Africa, including the book LNG Markets in Transition, The Great Reconfiguration, published in 2016. She is also a member of the Gas Tech governing body. And prior to joining the Center on Global Energy Policy, she was a senior leader and head of gas analysis at BP, where she was responsible for advising the leadership team on gas market developments and long-term pricing assumptions. Jim Krane is the Wallace S. Wilson Fellow for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He specializes in energy geopolitics with a focus on oil exporting countries and the challenges they face from energy subsidies, internal demand, and climate change. His scholarly articles have been published in Nature Energy, Energy Policy, Energy Journal, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and AGSIW, I should add. Previously, he spent nearly 20 years as a journalist, 6 of them in the Middle East. He's the author of 2 books, City of Gold, Dubai and the Dream of Capitalism, and Energy Kingdoms, Oil and Political Survival in the Persian Gulf. Also with us is Nikos Safos, the James R. Schleisinger Chair in Energy and Geopolitics with the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at CSIS. In this role, he oversees work on managing the geopolitics of energy and climate change, advancing industrial policies for clean energy, ensuring a just transition for workers and communities, and equipping U.S. foreign policy and the multilateral system to deal with climate change and the energy transition. Before CSIS, he worked for over a decade as a consultant and advised companies and governments in over 30 countries on some of the world's most complex energy projects. Moderating the session today is our good friend Robin Mills, the CEO of Qamar Energy and a non-resident fellow at AGSIW. He's an expert on energy strategy and economics and has led major consulting assignments for the EU in Iraq and for a variety of international oil companies on Middle East business development, integrated gas and power generation, and renewable energy. He worked for a decade for Shell, and is also a fellow at the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy and a senior fellow of the Iraq Energy Institute. Before we start, if you hadn't seen it yet, I wanted to flag the scene setter for this conference, Gulf Countries Gear Up for a Net Zero World, authored by AGSIW non-resident fellow Kate Dorian. I'll paste again the link to it in the chat with you all. It's really a wonderful, comprehensive publication. And with that, Robin, over to you.
Thank you, Raymond, and good morning, evening to everybody. Thanks for joining us at wherever you are in the world, and very much appreciate AGSIW's initiative in hosting this event. I'm sure many of you dialed in yesterday for the very interesting and wide-ranging conversation there. And today I'm delighted to have 3 top quality panelists with us to discuss the role of gas and renewable power generation in a carbon-constrained world, and of course with particular reference to the Middle East and the Gulf. And we're really at a very interesting time, really a very interesting development as relates to gas in the current situation. Some of the recent developments we're aware of, obviously we're in the middle of a gas crunch that is affecting Europe and East Asia. In particular, sharply rising prices, worries about supply adequacy, and the debate over, is this due to excessively fast transition to low carbon fuels, or insufficiently fast transition, or has it nothing to do with that? Nevertheless, I think this episode clearly is going to have important effects, longer term effects on investment in the gas industry and in the views on the low carbon energy transition. Another very interesting development recently, we've seen obviously several countries announcing net zero carbon policies by mid-century, and some of those being added in the run-up to COP26, which is beginning shortly. And one of the latest of these, the UAE, and the first major Middle East country, the first major non-OECD oil and gas exporter to announce a net zero carbon target. What implications does that have for the UAE's oil and gas industry, for the role of gas within its domestic economy, and more broadly for the Middle East, where we see more Middle East countries announcing net zero carbon targets, and what does that mean for the gas industry? So those are two of the very topical areas, and this is against a backdrop of longer term trends that we're well aware of, the push to increase gas use in the Middle East, to replace oil and as a source of additional exports, whether exporting gas directly or using it more for domestic industry, the attempts to meet gas shortages in the region through increased gas development, and the possible more tentative attempts and moves towards more gas integration, more trade between countries within the Middle East, as well as simply exporting it to the rest of the world. How have all these initiatives been affected by recent developments and those longer term trends? So that's just a few of the questions we hope to tackle today, and I also look forward to the audience's comments and questions. We will do our best to address those as far as possible also. And I'd like to begin by just asking our panelists in order to give a short opening statement, and we'll begin with Anne-Sophie. So over to you, Anne-Sophie.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you very much to the AGSIW for the invitation. Taking my former hat as a BP analyst, and I was responsible for the gas analysis in the energy outlook, I've very much seen the mood changing over natural gas over the past 5 years. We have moved to a world where natural gas demand is going to increase forever, to now the peak is in sight, and this is very interesting change indeed. And I think for natural gas to have a future in general, whatever the region or the country considered, the natural gas industry needs to achieve two things. The first one is to tackle the methane emission problem, and that can also include flaring. And this is an issue which is, important in the Middle East, but is important everywhere. And that has to be addressed relatively urgently, because a certain number of people are now attacking the natural gas industry on that specific theme, saying that natural gas is actually not cleaner than coal. So something that has to be tackled urgently. The second thing is that natural gas would also have to be increasingly decarbonized, and this is where the carbon capture, use and storage is very important. Whether you are using that directly in the Middle East or you are using that also in other countries as they are going to receive gas, it doesn't really matter. But the amount of CCUS which will have to be used will increase over time, or will have to increase over time if you want to continue to use gas. Otherwise, a lot of the CO2 emissions are going to come from natural gas. So that's, I think, quite important themes that the Middle East, as a consumer of gas, but also as an exporter of natural gas, and in particular LNG, will have to take into account. Why? Because, Europe is very much aware of these two issues, and Europe has been taking a leading position, especially on the methane emissions. And increasingly, Europe is going to look at the environmental footprint of natural gas. And make no mistake, this is also going to come very soon also for hydrogen, because there are many people who are starting to say, well, is green hydrogen, how green is blue hydrogen? How are we really taking into account the implied methane emissions, carbon emissions associated with that production? So the next years, the next decade are going to be the era of people who are going to be focusing on the accounting of emissions, carbon emission, methane emissions. And believe me, there is a very intense debate on all these type of emissions, and there is absolutely no agreement on how big or important they are. You can find pretty much every single number just on methane leakage, with people saying, oh, it's 0.2%, or actually the methane intensity or the methane leakage is as high as 3.5%. But what does that mean for natural gas demand in general and in the Middle East in particular? Well, it depends very much on what kind of scenario you are looking at. If you are, in the business as usual scenario, we are just continuing on the current trends, then natural gas demand in the world, especially in developed developing countries, and in particular in the Middle East, is going to increase. But if you believe that we need to reduce carbon emissions relatively rapidly, then at some point natural gas demand is going to have to peak, or it has already pretty much peaked in developed countries and will have to peak at some point in developing countries. And that would be the case not only for the Middle East, even though the Middle East has still some growth in perspective, but also the case for Asia. And Asia is a very important region for the Middle East because it's a key market for LNG exports. And when you are looking at the current strategy of Qatar, Qatar is going to expand massively its LNG export. And the key region for LNG imports is absolutely and definitely Asia. So when Robin mentioned, the current high gas prices, the number one question that everybody needs to have in his mind right now is what is going to be the implication of these high gas prices for these Asian consumers long term. I think we start to see part of the answer to that because China is signing long-term contract or trying to sign long-term contract, in particular with the US, as if there is no tomorrow. There is a frenzy. And China is a very important gas consumer. You can say that this is one of the key reasons why we are having this gas crisis. It's not the only reason. There are many reasons. But the growth in LNG import in China has been a key reason why we have this tightness on global LNG market. But beware that there are other very important gas consumers in Asia. This is India and the rest of Southeast Asian countries. And these countries, they are extremely price sensitive. And when they are seeing not only the high gas prices, but also the volatility of these prices, they are going to be worried whether natural gas indeed is a solution in the long term, is an affordable solution in the long term, because this theme of security and supply and affordability is going to be a key theme for the future. So these two things, natural gas as a source of demand, but also as a source of supply and exports in the Middle East, is going to be very important. But this is also related to something new that was not really looked at or considered before. This is hydrogen. And why is hydrogen important for the Middle East? This is because the Middle East has a lot of resources in terms of natural gas, which can be used to produce blue hydrogen, but is also endowed with a lot of solar and potentially wind resources as well, which can be a source for green hydrogen. Interesting point, however, is that very much unlike the natural gas market, where you can very much identify who is going to want to import LNG or natural gas in the future, there is still a lot of uncertainty on how much hydrogen would be needed in the future and in which countries. We can see Japan, Korea, maybe a bit of Europe, countries like Singapore being interested, but how much is this market really going to be? And, how much are they really going to want to import? And more importantly, and this is where, the kind of different approaches between different Middle Eastern countries is important. Do they want to continue to import natural gas as LNG, which is a product that they are comfortable with, and then you basically produce blue hydrogen on site, but that means that you need to have the CCUS available in the country which is importing, or else you would have to do something with the CO2, or will they want to import hydrogen as it is? So that's definitely a key question, and this is going to make maybe a slight difference between Qatar, which for the moment is looking at expanding the LNG exports, and other countries in the Middle East, such as Oman, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, which are more looking for the moment at ammonia or hydrogen exports. So very much a different appreciation and a different potentially export strategy there. But in a world where, we might very well see at some point LNG trade shrinking, and especially if you are looking at the latest IEA report, the net zero scenario is absolutely scary for any LNG exporter in the world because you have a very rapid decrease of LNG exports. This is a very important question to understand how LNG trade is going to evolve and whether there is an opportunity with hydrogen/ammonia. And there was a picture in the latest World Energy Outlook, which was showing, the importance of hydrogen in future trade, whereby it's a really big component of future total trade in $1 billion. I mean, we don't really know about the quantities. So with that, I would like to finish my opening statements. I hope I was not too long, and I have tried to cover, both natural gas but also hydrogen areas. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thanks, Anne-Sophie, for that fantastic scene setter. It's great to be here also at AGSIW. I think it's my second time speaking for this August institution, and I very much enjoyed the first time around. And this, looks like a fantastic event. So I want to have just a few short opening remarks, maybe in a bit of a different area, about the energy transition itself, and maybe looking at the Gulf and the oil and gas industry. I'm trying to maybe pick out a few winners and losers, or potential winners and losers. Of course, the big Gulf producers see threats and opportunities from climate change, right? I mean, on the threat side, one of the things that I've recently written about here with one of my colleagues is that this process of energy transition from fossil fuels to renewables really involves enormous reductions in material requirements, and therefore in trade and rents, right? So if you're talking about renewables, maybe hydrogen might be a separate case. But a recent paper that we published in Energy Research and Social Science Journal, which is, I'd be happy to share the link in the chat. It's right now it's available for free. But if you think about just the terms of the scale, the world produced about 350 times more coal than all the copper, rare earths, lithium, cobalt, graphite, and other materials. And no matter whether they were using energy transition applications or in something else. And of course, that coal gets burned up that year or in the next year. But those minerals and those raw materials for the energy transition capital equipment are not burned up, right? So they're used in equipment that produces power for decades, right? With no more requirements for mining or other, anything but a little bit of scheduled maintenance, hopefully. So the tonnage of materials involved is just a tiny fraction. So if you've got a business, if the energy business starts to transition towards less trade of commodities, less rents for governments, and becomes potentially even a smaller business overall, we may see these mineral-rich governments that emerge, the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Zambia, Cuba, et cetera, probably not commanding the same kind of geopolitical influence as oil. At the same, even as they're replacing, fossil fuels, probably coal first, maybe a bit of oil from the EV market. So as the demand for these commodities starts to go down, rent portions will probably also decrease unless we've got a really strong OPEC that really takes up the mantle here, and we have some shared sacrifice. Of course, non-combustion uses for oil are there, and petrochemicals is growing really quickly. But if you think about the petrochemicals, just doesn't hold the same strategic importance that transport fuel does. So we may see so maybe a falling away of some of the geopolitical importance that's accorded to the fossil fuel trade. Any rent-dependent regimes will probably have to respond by changing some of their government practices, and we're starting to see a little bit of this. More taxes, maybe a bit more openness and social freedoms, coupled with a bit more repression that we're seeing. So of course, the biggest threat of all is the physical one, the rising temperatures that we've seen. So including this crazy 54-degree record that was set back in 2016 in Kuwait and in southern Iraq. So on the opportunity side, some of the things that Anne-Sophie was talking about, the Gulf looks really well placed for, right? So and we're seeing kind of climate action suggesting a tilt of the playing field in favor of these big state-owned national oil companies, especially the efficient, the biggest and most efficient ones in the Gulf. so even if the oil and gas market shrinks a bit, we might see these NOCs gaining some market share. They've got low costs, low upstream carbon emissions. They've also got cheap sun and wind. They've also got cheap land, so they can make cheap hydrogen with that. And they've got cheap money, right? They've got great access to debt markets at really low sovereign rates. So so these NOCs, or maybe soon to be called NECs, their job is to produce rents to support the state and support the regime. And I think the regime is going to reciprocate by insulating them as much as possible from external pressures and climate action. And so they'll need to. They probably start viewing their unsold oil and gas resources underground as a liability that they're going to need to monetize, maybe step up their depletion horizon before it starts to lose value. But these NOCs are better placed than IOCs for the most part, right? So IOCs have to. These shareholder-owned companies have to answer to their shareholders. Shareholders, of course, have different concerns, include the climate. The IOCs probably have greater flexibility, smaller reserves base, probably not viewed as much as a liability, but they're exposed to activist pressure, to litigation, to regulatory changes, increasing taxes, et cetera. And they're being discouraged from upstream investment in some cases and encouraged to adopt new business models. And we're seeing some acceptance of that, right? So I think NOC is probably likely to survive and thrive in the medium term as the oil market shifts for them towards them. Lower prices, probably less of a risk for these government-owned, ADNOCs and Aramco, as long as those governments have diversified their fiscal options outside oil and gas, which we're also starting to see. So I guess I just start off with a little bit of that and hand it over to Nikos.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. I've been making some adjustments to the things I have to say, listening to Anne-Sophie and Jim, so that's helpful. I want to start off by maybe a little bit of a scene setter, how I see the Middle East and gas, because we can talk a little bit about 2030, 40, 50, and net zero in that world, but I think it's sometimes helpful to ground ourselves on where things stand today. And the reality today is that the Middle East is a huge gas market. In fact, if you look at the demand growth of the last decade for natural gas in the world, most of it came from three places: North America, China, and the Middle East. And today, Iran and Saudi Arabia together consume more gas than China. Okay, so we have to think of the Middle East as a gas market of a serious scale. It's a bigger gas consumer than the European Union. It has the highest share of primary energy coming from gas in the world, having surpassed the former Soviet Union. There are some signs that we may be reaching some levels of maturity with consumption in a few places plateauing. But the oil to gas switching that we talked about in the beginning, that's continuing, without any evidence of slowdown. And as a result of that, and I think it's going to be critical as we think about the future, the share of renewable energy is super low. Looking at the BP statistical review that Anne-Sophie used to work on, it's about 0.5% of primary energy from renewables. Globally, it's about 5.5%, right? So it's 1/10 of the global average, right? I think that's going to be relevant when we talk about, can you export solar-based hydrogen to the world? Maybe solar-based hydrogen is not going to come from a world that has the lowest share of primary energy from renewable energy resources, right? So I'll come back to that point later. So that's point number one. Point number two is, if I can build on what Anne-Sophie said, there's been a huge shift in how we think about gas. And the main shift, in my view, is that gas was always thought of as being energy transition proof, that the energy transition was going to happen and gas was going to do great. And I think it's quite clear that this is not the case, that if you want to have a serious move to net zero, gas is going to have to be shrank as a business significantly. So if you look at the IEA net zero, gas demand shrinks by more than half. The LNG market is 62% smaller in 2050, even after rising a little bit. And the gas industry itself really changes, right? I mean, gas loses completely the touch with the consumer. Gas gets out of buildings, doesn't really make much inroads in transportation. It's largely an industrial fuel for heavy industry with CCS, a little bit for electricity generation, and a lot of it for hydrogen production. So it's a really different business that we haven't really thought through what that world looks like for natural gas. But one thing is clear, saying that your energy transition strategy is investing more in gas no longer sounds plausible the way it did maybe 5 years ago. That's point number two. Point number three is to go zoom in a little bit on the LNG market. The last decade, in part because of Qatar's strategy, the Middle East lost a lot of market share in the LNG market. It used to be about 40% of the market at its high point. Now it's closer to 25% as Australia, the US, and Russia scaled up their exports. And that's going to change with Qatar's expansion. And obviously, Qatar's expansion also is a huge signal to the rest of the world that Qatar wants to come back and recapture its market share. I think what we don't quite know is, how competitive that gas is going to be in the world. So much of the demand growth in the last 5 years has come from China. The growth in demand has not been quite as great in other parts of the world, and there's a real competitiveness issue. But the longer term challenge, I think, for LNG is we don't really know what this market is going to evolve into, right? I mean, there's different ways to think about who's going to sell the last LNG cargo, right? Is it going to be the country that has the cheapest gas? Is it going to be the country that has the cleanest gas? Is it going to be the country that is the most desperate to sell that cargo? And depending on what answer you give to that question, you get very different answers to what this market looks like. But one thing is clear, Qatar is well positioned no matter how you cut this world. But it's a Qatar story. Like LNG is not a Middle East story. I mean, not as an exporter to the world and, supplying gas to the world. I mean, even Egypt is kind of like running out of steam. Obviously, some countries are still importers like Kuwait and the UAE. But frankly, if we talk about the role of gas as a supplier, or the role of the Middle East as a supplier of gas to the world, this is almost exclusively a Qatar story, right? So I think it's important that we don't talk about it as a Middle East story as much as it is a Qatar story. Let me make two more comments and then I'll stop. One is on net zero commitments. I think there's a lot of interesting political economy dimensions to these commitments. You can think of these commitments as an external commitment, so telling the world that you're on board, that you're a good global citizen. But it's also an internal signaling to tell your industry and your constituents and stakeholders at home that you need to create the products that the world is going to need in 20 and 30 years. And I think there's a lot of that happening in the Middle East. Having said that, when you think about the challenges of international oil companies in making this transition from an international oil company to an international energy company, yes, they are subject to public shareholder pressure, and that constrains some of their flexibility. But I think it's not fair to assume that national oil companies are going to be that much nimbler, or it will be far easier for them to do this. I mean, this is a tough institutional shift, right? When a company has over decades done 2 or 3 things, ask them to do 3 or 4 different things, even if they're somewhat related, it's not obvious that this will be a successful organizational challenge, right? And so the question of whether you can evolve into these new businesses, these are not, with some exceptions, these are not institutions that are known for their nimbleness, flexibility, and ability to adapt quickly to new market conditions, right? And so I think that poses a real threat to how we think about the political economy of these places. I'll make a final comment on hydrogen. I want to actually build on the graph that Anne-Sophie talked about. So if you look at those numbers, the IEA says that the global trade in energy in 2050 is going to be about $900 billion. again, like who knows, right? So let's not get too caught up on the number. But that hydrogen will be 35% of that, right? So that's about a $300-something billion market. So if you put in the scale of today's oil and gas market, it's not very big, right? It's much smaller than what we trade today in oil and gas. It's much smaller than what what OPEC countries earn from selling hydrocarbons. So it's a much smaller market. I think there are two additional questions that emerge. There is a tendency, and I come from the gas world, there is a tendency to try to fit hydrogen into our mental models for gas, that like hydrogen is going to evolve the way that gas is going to evolve. And maybe that's true, but maybe it's not. And one of the reasons it might not is some people have gas and some people don't, and that's why we trade it. But more or less everyone can do hydrogen. And if you look at the cost competitiveness of hydrogen in one part of the world versus another, and then you look at the cost of transporting hydrogen over long distances, it's not obvious that the hydrogen business is going to be a long haul business. There may be some corridors for exporting and importing hydrogen. Maybe it is a couple of countries in the Middle East and Australia selling hydrogen or a variation of hydrogen, ammonia or something, to Japan and Korea. It's possible that this is about what the hydrogen market, international, like interregional market for hydrogen looks like in 2040, 2050. And so if you add the value of hydrogen and what this market looks like, if you add that you may just have a lot more domestic production meeting domestic demand, or short-term trade, or short distance trade, that's a very different market to break into, and to think that this could be a substitute for the kind of rents that today oil and gas generate for the Middle East. And then the final point, which is where I started, is, in an economy where 0.5% of energy comes from renewable energy resources, talking about exporting hydrogen based on the renewable energy surplus that you will have at home is a little bit far-fetched, right? I mean, you need to have a lot more growth in renewable energy to make a plausible case that you'll have enough renewable energy to go around to generate hydrogen, to export that hydrogen. And even then, I think we have to think very hard about what this international market for hydrogen is going to be, and the ability of the Middle Eastern countries and institutions and national oil companies to evolve to take advantage of that hydrogen market. That's not clear at all. So let me stop there.
Okay, thanks to the three of you for those really very thought-provoking opening statements. A lot to unpack there. I guess I'd like to start, and probably Anne-Sophie, you'd be the first to answer this, but other two panelists do feel free to comment on this too. I'd like to start with kind of one of the more immediate issues that's facing us, and that is the current energy crunch, which is, I guess, a gas and power and coal crunch, perhaps more than oil crunch right now. And particularly affecting Europe as well as East Asia. Part of this is blamed, of course, on strategic behavior by Russia, or is it just Russian production constraints, infrastructure constraints? Whatever it is, Russia is clearly a factor in this. What would you say about the role of the Middle East in this? And Nikos has pointed out that Middle East gas export is really a Qatar story. What do you see as the relationship there between the Gulf and I guess particularly with Qatar versus the Europeans and the way the European decarbonisation agenda is going? What strategic role does Qatar and possibly other Gulf countries play as a guarantor of energy security for Europe, not in oil as it used to be, but more these days in gas?
I wouldn't say that Russia is the only responsible behind this crisis. I think it's playing a role. I mean, it's playing a role because it's not meeting expectations that there would be higher gas exports towards Europe. And, they also have domestic demand that they are keen to underline is very important, injection needs, because their demand for winter is particularly high. But you have also to look at that in the context of there have been 15 years of particularly difficult relationships between the European Union and Russia. And, after all these things and, the problems with Nord Stream 2, it's not really a surprise that Russia is saying, oh, well, you need gas now, But coming back to the role of indeed, I mean, for Europe, the key supplier of natural gas / LNG is definitely Qatar. I mean, from the Middle East, this is really the only one which matters because this is the only one from which we are actually seeing LNG. I would say that LNG is a particularly important source of natural gas for Europe, especially because they like to have relatively good and diversified and also flexible sources of supply. However, I mean, one important thing that sometimes, Europe tends to forget is that they are also in the global LNG market. There's a balancing market. When you have too much gas, then, this excess supply is going to come to Europe. When there is not enough gas, which is exactly what is happening now, I mean, the LNG tends to be pulled towards Asia, and therefore Europe is at a deficit, which usually is compensated by three different things: coal to gas switching, additional exports of pipeline gas, and storage. Well, I mean, there is not that much coal to gas switching these days, or at least it has been used to the maximum it can, especially taking into account the coal shortages. Russia is unwilling or unable to export more natural gas towards Europe. So we are left with storage, which is pretty low as we are starting winter. But I think looking forward, I mean, there will still be an important role, at least for the decade, for natural gas imports. And however you are looking at the picture, given that there is this push towards less coal and there is going to be less nuclear in Europe power generation for the next decade, then there is still going to be an important role for natural gas. And therefore, imports for natural gas are very unlikely to diminish in the next decade, and they are not going to diminish very rapidly unless you have a very extreme scenario, So that's a very important point. Now, I think also Europe will have to look differently at how it is looking at security of supply. Because what the current events have shown us is that, well, renewable generation is by definition extremely unpredictable, and unusual weather events can exacerbate the demand both sides, both by increasing winter demand or heating demand and also increasing demand for cooling. And you might not always have, I mean, in that case, what we have seen is that there has been lower hydro, and there has been also lower wind. And my point is that, the whole of LNG as this flexible source of gas supply will probably become more and more important, but there will also be maybe increased volatility in that supply of natural gas. I hope I know it's a very long answer to your question, but there are so many ways to look at this question that you could talk about it for 1 hour. I'm sorry if it was a little bit too long. And if you want to see more thoughts about that, I put my latest report on the chat, so for people who are interested.
Yeah. No, thanks. That was excellent. That was indeed to the point that I was asking about. I think what's remarkable to me is, if we look at the current European gas, if you want to call it a crisis, nothing dramatic has really happened, right? There's no call for Russian supplies. Perhaps they're a bit lower. There's no collapse there's no major interruptions in production. There's no really very unusual weather. Wind's a bit lower, but nothing amazing. We're not even really in winter yet. And yet you have these amazing record prices.
This is what you need to understand. It has been very progressive. The problems which have led to the current energy crisis have been extremely progressive over the year. And it's only in September that we have realized, oh, we really do have a problem now. Ouch. And it's not only about gas, it's also about coal. And this is one of the problems. When you have a supply problem, if there is absolutely no alternative source of supply, then you turn to demand. And one potential solution, if you forget about carbon emission, is switching to coal. In that case, this is very difficult because guess what? China is desperate for coal, and there are other Asian countries like India who are starting to really look at coal supplies as well.
Yep. Yeah, so it's indeed not just a European crisis, but an interlinked one. Nikos, I think you had some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, no, if I can build, I think on a couple of things that Anne-Sophie said. And I think number one, you're absolutely right. I agree with you, Robin, that if you look at the fundamentals, there's no reason that the gas price should be at the highest level that it's ever been. I think this is totally unjustified. But if you think about the structure of this crisis, right? We always talk about gas and renewables and coal. This is not really the issue, right? I mean, what is happening is that we're going to winter where we massively ramp up gas consumption in Europe to meet our heating needs. And essentially what's driving the price today is a fear that we don't have enough gas in storage, which I don't think is actually quite accurate, but that's the fear, right? So it's really that we don't have enough in the pantry to make it through the winter. And that's fundamentally a story about space heating in Europe, not about electricity generation per se. And I think that, to bring us back to the Middle East, is an important thing that we have to think about more, which is we talk about LNG as a flexible thing, and LNG is flexible, but LNG is geographically flexible. You can send it to one part of the world, you can send it to another. And by the way, one of the reasons that Europe has imported less LNG is because Qatar has been sending LNG to Asia rather than Europe this year. And of course, that's what anyone sensible would do. I'm not criticizing Qatar, I'm just saying this is what happened. But LNG is not flexible to ramp up and down production. LNG is not very seasonally flexible. Whatever seasonal flexibility exists in the system usually goes towards Asia. And so in a period of time when European production is declining, but European consumption, that seasonal swing is still there, you don't have great systems for balancing the European gas system if there isn't enough gas in the summer to fill up the storage completely, right? And so I think that is a structural challenge that we have to think about as we talk about LNG and the reliance on LNG going forward and the role that different players are going to have. So I saw, Qatar last week said, we think these prices are very high, they're unhealthy. And I said, that's great, but Qatar is producing at 100%. And it doesn't really matter if you're a big producer. What you need in those moments is producers with spare capacity, producers that can produce more on short notice. And that's not how the LNG system works. Let me make one final point on the Russia-Qatar dynamic. I think, it's quite interesting. I think Russia is managed to alienate whatever people it has not alienated in Europe over the last 10, 15 years on natural gas. I think Russia has been just very unhelpful and very unclear with the messages that it's delivering to Europe. One day it's we don't have gas. The other day it's, well, we do have gas, but you have to ask us nicely. Some days it's like, well, we do have gas, but you have to approve Nord Stream 2. Some days is gas, you guys just brought it on yourselves. It's all your fault. So it's very, very different messages, I think, of what's coming out of Russia. What is clear is that no one in Europe is coming out of this crisis thinking, oh, we need to give a better signal to Russia to deliver us more gas. Like, I think that is the only thing we can come out of this knowing for sure, is that the appetite for engaging with Russia, whatever it was before this moment, is going to be lower just because the Russian role has been, I think, incredibly unhelpful, and the signaling has been incredibly unhelpful, which is an opportunity for other suppliers. The challenge for Europe is the same challenge that it's been for the last 10, 15 years, that it's very difficult to push diversification and decarbonization at the same time. It's very difficult at the same time to tell people that you want them to invest to give you gas, while also telling them that you would like to stop using their gas as quickly as possible. That is at the core of Europe's energy security challenge. It has been the case for the last 10, 15 years. And there's nothing that really Europe is doing to get out of the fundamental tension between these two messages, that you want people to give you gas and you want other suppliers to supply you, but also you would like to stop using gas as quickly as is humanly possible. And there's a stark contradiction between these two messages.
Yeah, excellent points. And you certainly don't want any new pipelines into Europe, and you certainly don't want European banks financing anything like this. So, and indeed, that kind of relates to my original thought of, so where indeed does the Middle East fit in this as a potentially a more politically palatable supplier? I'd like to turn away a little bit from that question and think more about the domestic drivers within the Middle East. And I'm particularly keen to get Jim's thoughts on this, because I know you've written on this extensively, Jim. The shift that we've seen to more domestic use of gas in the Middle East, the struggle of the Middle East to produce enough gas for its own needs and to overcome gas shortages. That over the past few years, I think, has borne fruit. Okay, Egypt has managed to become self-sufficient and even go back to being a little exporter again. Saudi Arabia producing more gas, trying to displace domestic oil. UAE has a self-sufficiency ambition, and other countries as well. So that problem that you wrote about, particularly over the past few years, that response has come or is coming. Part of the step beyond this is obviously to bring in renewables, and in the case of the UAE, nuclear power as well, to displace oil and gas, depending where you are. I'm curious about your thoughts about what does this do to the domestic economy of these countries? Obviously, gas has been given a big role as a domestic, as a driver of domestic development, as a driver of industry, and so on. Just curious to your thoughts about how far does that go? Is gas really able to take over as a kind of motor of economic development, and how has that changed since the 70s when the first big gas capture projects in the region really started up?
Well, it's Robin, I should say, before launching into this, but you just co-edited an excellent volume that covers a lot of these problems in detail, right? So looking at gas, interfacing gas and renewables in various countries around the Middle East. Really a good book that you and Lee Chen Sim at Zayed University just co-edited that I contributed one piece on the UAE to. Really awesome book. So if anybody's
much appreciate your contribution too, Jim, of course, on the UAE.
Yeah, so gas was like, of course, the it was the I think I wrote about it as like the Hollywood stuntman in in the Middle East, right? So it was it had all these big roles that and never got any of the credit. All the credit went to oil for bringing in the rents and commanded the headlines and even the ministry's names. But here's gas behind the scenes doing all the work in these economies. It was cheap. It was being flared off. Before nationalization. The Western IOCs that held those concessions had no interest in it. Saw it as a waste product, flared it off. Or even when Shell discovered the North Field in offshore Qatar, they capped it in the early 70s and didn't start to tap into. The Qataris didn't tap into it until 1995, right? So lots of gas, so sort of this latent resource that's kind of recently come into its own. But the structure of pricing in the Gulf that I've been writing about really thwarted, undermined, building a trading network in the Gulf and having pricing hubs and some of the other things that build that allow these countries to integrate their natural gas systems and the resource base is it's kind of concentrated in two countries, Iran and Qatar, which for various reasons are kind of on the outs politically with the countries where most of the demand is taking place or where they're underserved, right? So you've had this kind of bizarre situation where you've got two net importers within a few hundred miles of the world's largest non-associated gas field. Countries that are importing LNG from the United States and Russia and other places, and can't access enough gas for their own use. And, some of this is based on extremely low prices over half a century now or more in some cases that haven't budged, right? So Kuwait is still selling electricity for about 1/2 of 1 US cent, price that was set in stone, it seems seemingly in 1966 and hasn't changed since then. So we have this kind of lots of wealth and rising incomes coupling with really low structurally low pricing that's caused lots and lots of demand. Going forward, it's getting tougher because the Saudis especially have been really pushing hard to substitute for gas, substitute for oil and power generation. And what it seems like, they're having I guess they've got this problematic role that they're in OPEC, and they're called upon to cut oil production, and they tend to take the biggest sacrifice on themselves, which is really thwarting them from producing enough gas, because a lot of the gas that they're producing, and most of it is associated gas, sorry. And when they're taking oil off the market, they're also taking gas off the market, so it leaves them stuck, where they started, still burning oil. So tricky problem, and their foreign policies of these some of these gas short countries. So the Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Bahrain, have been, especially Saudi and the UAE, new leadership in these countries, a bit more interventionist foreign policy that's kind of made them look at potential dependencies, in places like Qatar or Iran, with more from more of a strategic position, where they want to avoid allowing countries to have a veto over their foreign policy. So they want to be more self-sufficient. So you see the UAE now, building a big coal-fired power plant in Dubai, which, if it's finished, it'll be the largest in the Middle East, right? So, spending lots of money to clean up its sour gas, and to strip out the hydrogen sulfide. So, lots of reasons, I guess. Nothing I can point to as one initial one strong central factor, but complicated mix that's you have countries like the UAE now trying to move away from gas, trying to diversify away from gas in their power sector. So interesting mix.
Yes, I think thanks for those comments, because that brings a couple of thoughts to mind. One is, and I'd like to touch on both of these, I guess, with the whole panel. The first one is you point to the diversification of the energy mix, and to some extent you could say almost going backwards in the sense of bringing in coal, but on the other side bringing in nuclear power in the case of the UAE, and solar and wind more generally in the region, even if, as Nikos points out, that's at a very low level today, but gaining momentum. So there's that kind of diversification of the domestic energy mix, and when we think of the net zero goals, of course, that becomes increasingly important, because obviously to get anywhere net zero, that means backing oil out of the power system and replacing it with gas, and then replacing that gas with zero carbon systems, whether that's renewables, nuclear, or gas with CCS or hydrogen, some blend of those. So that's the first question I'd like the panel to touch on is what, at the moment it's only the UAE that has a net zero commitment, but if other countries join that and make serious progress, what does that do to the domestic energy systems? And the second question I'd like to ask is about regional connectivity. You've mentioned the paradox that you've got two of the countries with amongst the world's largest gas reserves, Qatar and Iran, and one of them being one of the world's largest gas exporters, within very close proximity to other countries which are net importers, and yet with no pipeline connectivity and maybe some limited LNG trade. However, there have been some developments in regional gas connectivity elsewhere, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean, gas going from Israel now to Egypt and Jordan. There's been, of course, diplomatic normalization, so-called Abraham Accords between the UAE and Israel and various other regional states and Israel. To what extent do we see regional gas connectivity? It's always been a bit of a mirage for political and commercial reasons, but do we see that now taking off and advancing, or does the region remain this strange mix of long distance trade combined with domestic self-sufficiency and not a lot in the middle? So a couple of questions there, one on the net zero ambitions and one on the regional pipeline connectivity, which I throw open to the whole panel, whoever would like to jump in on that.
Can I maybe kick us off with some thoughts on those? two questions, Robin. So first, the diversification of the mix. I mean, it's clear that you need a huge push to diversify the mix. Oil to gas has been essentially the name of the game for the better part of 4 or 5 decades, and you really need to go beyond that. I think as you say, we're not really seeing evidence of that outside of the UAE so far, but I do think there's one element that is that will be helpful for the Middle East as it undergoes this transition, and that is especially for the fuel that we're talking about, gas. Gas is largely like a heavy, big users kind of business in the Middle East, with the exception of Iran. And if you go to Egypt, there's a little bit more gas use and in buildings and in the distribution center. But it's largely like a heavy industry, power and industry kind of business, which actually makes it like a lot easier to think about a transition, right? Because you're really talking about a select number of nodes that you have to switch over in order to bring about change. You think about, what Anne-Sophie was saying before, like buildings in Europe, like, my God, that's going to be a tough thing to decarbonize, right? Just thinking about the number of connections and the number of people and the coordination challenge of getting that system to flip over. So in a system that is largely based on big, heavy users, I think there is an advantage there. But as we've said multiple times, the clock hasn't really started outside of the UAE in terms of really pushing for the diversification of the mix. On the point of regional connectivity, I guess maybe a couple of observations. It's I used to always joke that back in the day, Hugo Chavez wanted to build a big gas pipeline from Venezuela all the way down to Argentina, and it was always a silly idea. But the region ended up doing the same thing through LNG, that it sort of connected and became integrated through LNG because it was easier and cheaper than building a big pipeline from a place that didn't have enough gas to sell to begin with. And I think that's a little bit of what you've seen in the Gulf, right? Where, if you go 10, 12 years ago, there was a lot of skepticism about whether Qatar would be supplying the region. You had this whole stories about Qatar LNG going to Belgium and then getting reloaded to Belgium so that it could go to Kuwait. And a lot of that stuff has disappeared, right? That the sensitivities have disappeared. And, Qatar is a steady supplier of LNG into Kuwait. And so some of that normalization has happened. On the East Med, I think it's very interesting. We can talk about the East Med more if you want. But, in some ways, it's a success story, but in some ways, it's also a failure. And I think it's a failure primarily if you look at it in a comparative context. There was actually like a lot of regional trade like 12 years ago from Egypt exporting gas to Israel and to Jordan, from Egypt exporting gas to the world. And in some ways that went away and then it came back. So what we talk about as a regional connectivity success story in the East Med is largely a recovery of the business that existed 15 years ago that kind of went away. And I think it's quite possible that we will never get the same kind of exports out of the East Med as we did when Egypt first started exporting LNG in 2006. If you look at the Egyptian volumes, they're probably never going to come back to that world from a global perspective. The regional perspective, you may get back to where you were in 2010, but not much above that. So it's a success story, but it's not a recent success story. What I think is the big question mark for me, and I don't know the answer to this, I just know that I don't buy the story. Over the last, I think, like 4 months, Egypt has signed power linking agreements with Saudi, with it wants to sell electricity to Iraq via Jordan, with Cyprus, with Greece now. There's connectivity with Sudan. And knowing everything I know about the gas industry in Egypt, I find it very questionable that Egypt is going to be this massive supplier of electricity into the world. But it's something that we also tried in the Gulf. I think at some point we thought that we're going to have a much better Gulf power market than we would have a gas market. And I'm not sure that really played out in the way that people thought. The idea being that power lines were less politically controversial than gas pipelines. But we never, I think, really saw that market take off. But there's something interesting happening in Egypt. I just don't think the numbers are there to back up the type of vision that the Egyptians seem to have for themselves as being able to export electricity and trade electricity with everyone, because they're getting to the point where they have barely enough surplus gas to export it. And so if you don't have gas to export using existing facilities, it's very hard to see how you're going to have enough electricity as a surplus to export to all these other countries.
Yeah, thanks. And the other two panelists, Anne-Sophie and Jim, if you have thoughts either on the impact of the net zero on the domestic economy or on the regional connectivity side.
Nikos has already made a very comprehensive answer, but looking at the first question, you tend to look very much at the supply side. I would argue that the demand side is also very important. I was talking previously in our chat before we started about the difficulty of insulating houses. Of course, it's not about insulating houses from a heating demand in the Middle East, but I think energy efficiency should not be discounted in that region as well. And there is probably some work which can be done there. So that's something that you need to take into account. As for, coal being part of the diversification, well, I am not sure this is really going in the right direction. I really wonder, for how long this coal power plant is going to survive in the current environment unless it has CCUS adapted to it. That's definitely one thing to ask. And as for the growth of renewable, I think I kind of agree with Nikos on the fact that it has been very slow so far, but I do have hope that this is going to build up. I was just glancing at the BP stats, and Vietnam last year, their renewable electricity generation grew more than the whole Middle East. So you are really wondering how this is even possible. So, I think there is some work to be done in the region because there is potential, but basically you need to start working on developing solar and wind. So that's a key observation.
I could chime in a little bit, especially on that the UAE net zero goal, and it just strikes me as initially when you hear about it, it's maybe a little bit bizarre, a bit far-fetched that here's a country that's building a coal-fired power plant and raising its oil production by about 40% over the next few years, up to 5 million barrels a day. At the same time as announcing a net zero commitment, right? So it sounds bizarre, right? This is one of the world's most emissions intensive places on earth. In a few years, it actually topped the scale a couple of times. Now it's got 29 years to go to net zero, right? So sounds a bit far-fetched. But there, as you've written, Robin, it has some advantages, right? And it's got these. A lot of its emissions are coming from these clusters of smokestacks in industrial zones that could be those could be sort of siphoned off, and it's got geological storage in close proximity. It's got lots. These are wealthy countries. They've in the UAE especially. It's got sovereign wealth funds that can be tasked to look at this issue, and sort of try and bring in useful technology and maybe even monetize that in some way. They've got oil rents right now they're extraordinarily high. They can invest that in power generation, electricity storage, and in generating hydrogen. The nuclear sector even, right? So, this 5.6 gigawatts of nuclear power, whenever that comes online, if that power is not all spoken for at night, that's also another great source of electrolysis, generating hydrogen if that's available. Building out renewables and saving oil and gas for export has kind of been the mantra for a while. I think that subsidy reforms that have been happening have helped. That at least electricity demand is showing some signs of plateauing in a few places. Maybe even it seems to be bouncing back this year, but it looked like it was coming down for a while. So there's some aspects of this, and they also have the type of governance there. This sort of hereditary monarchy where The successor is kind of on the program, on with his dad's or his brother's program, and kind of make sure it comes to fruition. So you can make these sort of decades-long plans and have pretty good confidence that your successor is going to take it seriously and try to bring it home. So there are some aspects of this, and also even if ADNOC does expand its oil production, so much, those emissions are going to be tallied outside the UAE, right? So all of these investments in greening up, the surrounding landscape are going to benefit it and help it, keep being able to market that oil to places, especially if we start seeing carbon and border adjustment mechanisms that are starting to target even commodities like oil. That'll be an advantage for. So there are lots of good reasons to do this, and I guess we have to wish them luck in this case.
Yeah, indeed. It's an odd paradox. We're talking about a world in which the UAE will, in principle, be net zero, but its customers won't be, or at least they'll be using its oil and gas in some non-emitting way. So that's leads nicely into a couple of questions we got from the audience. Two are quite similar, so I'll take them together. They really relate to the certification of net zero or offset oil and gas exports, and particularly LNG exports. So again, I throw this up to the whole panel, and I think Anne-Sophie, you've written about this previously as well. What is there in terms of potential for certified offset cargoes of whether oil or gas, but let's say LNG, and what are the kind of market mechanisms that are being used or can be used to encourage that?
To be absolutely honest, I have always had a little bit of skepticism on this whole thing about offset, because I think we need more clarity on exactly how this is working. I mean, what I find is that the carbon, the offsets that are currently being used, we need a lot more clarity on what exactly they are doing and whether they are actually reducing carbon emissions associated with them. But this is an interesting concept.
I was at a conference recently with David Victor where he actually described offsets as fraud. So I think there's some folks out there, Anne-Sophie, that share your skepticism.
I am skeptical. I think this requires a lot more attention. And again, like everything I have said, there will be increasing scrutiny on carbon emissions and how carbon emissions are accounted for. And this is going to be for the CO2, this is going to come for the methane, this is going to come for natural gas, this is to come for every single fuel, and very soon for hydrogen as well. And there are a lot of discussions, there is a lot of controversy about which number you are using. But this is going to be about that, because what people don't like is uncertainty. And the European Commission, the European Union has been taking a leading role in that. This is going to influence probably the rest of the world, although there is a lot of work to be done. And this is not only about the methane initiative, this is also about, the CBAM and how they are going to exactly understand, the carbon content of the different types of products like steel and aluminium. But, when you are importing steel, you don't want to disadvantage the products which are produced in Europe. So you are going to tax these products coming from different countries accordingly. But again, there will need to be a lot of assumptions being made on exactly how much carbon is contained there. So, if people don't know what to do for their future career, I think carbon accounting is the way to go.
Can I maybe add one observation? I think it's really important not to conflate what it seems to me are three different things. One is offsets, right? Where you're selling a cargo and you are coming up with a number of what emissions are associated with that cargo, and you're putting some money towards offsetting those emissions, right? a ton of questions there about the quality of the offsets, about what numbers you're using, how much of the value chain you're covering, all well known. That's like one thing. Better data is a different thing, right? Which is that there's a lot of assumptions we're making and a lot of back of the envelope calculations we're doing about the emissions intensity of the gas value chain. We have satellite data that is continuously changing how we understand those emissions. There's a lot of effort to try to go from sort of emissions factors to actual measurement, where we actually measure things, as opposed to just saying, well, we use this much gas, therefore we use this equation, and therefore this is how much CO2 or methane or whatever was associated with that. So, measurement and better measurement and verification and better data is sort of a different thing, right? So you can think of carbon offsets as being hugely suspicious and rubbish or whatever. Better data is a different thing, right? Because better data opens up a bunch of other stuff. And then there's something in the middle, which is clear, verifiable ways of reducing the emissions footprint of the gas, right? So when Qatar says, I want to do CCS, when you have projects in the US saying, I want to do LNG with CCS, or I want to power the liquefaction facility with electricity generated from low carbon energy sources, that's a different thing, right? That is a clear part of the value chain, which of course is not a huge part of the emissions. The huge part of the emissions is always the combustion, right? So, but it is an effort to lower the carbon intensity of a known part of the emissions chain, whether this is upstream, liquefaction, or the shipping. And so I think, I too, like Anne-Sophie, I'm incredibly skeptical about the quality of carbon offsets and what people are doing and what we know about them. But I think it's important to separate out different things that people are doing in this space, and especially to applaud anything that is about transparency and data and verification and getting a better handle on what the numbers are, so we don't have Americans saying our gas is 5 times better than Russia, and Russia saying, no, our gas is 5 times better than American gas. Like, we can't have this be the world, because we have no idea what to do with that kind of contradiction. And also to distinguish that from like clear places where there are emissions associated with a facility and you have a clear way to reduce those emissions, and that is something we should reward, right? So I think it's important to speak about sort of green LNG or whatever you want to call it, and distinguish between these 3 different things.
Thanks. Yeah, and that really strikes me as it raises some very interesting questions there. This whole certification issue. For example, and this particularly leads when we start thinking about hydrogen. There's a big debate in Europe now, blue versus green. Does that matter? Well, if you can certify that your blue is very low carbon because you're excellent on reducing leakage and using CCS in the upstream and so on, your life cycle as low carbon as green, why would you discriminate just on the basis of a production method? And yet we know that discrimination is certainly part of the debate. The other interesting angle there, I think, from a European point of view, again, is when you talk about high energy-intensive products like steel being imported into Europe. Again, imagine that you're a green steel producer in the Middle East because you've got excellent solar and wind resources, and you can undercut all of the European steel industry and with provably very low carbon methods. Is Europe actually going to accept that and say, well, yes, we're happy to see our domestic steel industry disappear because it's not carbon or cost competitive? So these are pretty interesting implications of this trend. One issue there, I think, relates to CCS, and we've got a question to the audience, which I'd like to take. Many of the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement from the Middle East, and particularly from the Gulf, include carbon capture and storage as a key part, not surprisingly, given the link to the oil and gas industry. I'd like to get the panel's thoughts on what is the role of CCS. There are indeed a couple of projects in the region. UAE, Saudi have CCS projects, but it has to take a much bigger role to satisfy these NDCs and to satisfy the net zero commitments. So appreciate the panel's thoughts on where CCS can go, should go in the region.
If no one else is jumping in, I can maybe offer 2 quick thoughts. I mean, one, in the spirit of what we've been talking about, which is, oil and gas institutions and countries doing things that oil and gas countries know how to do. CCS seems like an obvious choice, right? That it is a much clearer business to transition to that leverages things that you really know how to do, industrial processes, drilling and storing and handling hydrocarbons. So from that perspective, you can think of CCS as a good match for the region's sort of talents and expertise. The flip side to that is, it's not obvious to me what the business model is besides dipping your toes and trying to figure out if this thing works, right? I mean, if you look at other parts of the world, there are clear like tax incentives, credits, or carbon prices. And so, yes, you can say that there's a role for demonstration projects and pilot projects to try to get into this business and understand its merits. But it's not incredibly clear if the market doesn't value this, or if there isn't a revenue associated with this effort, how much you can really go down this path, right? We always talk about this in the United States, that yes, you can have a lot of money for hydrogen for CCS, and we have a tax credit and all that. But if there's no cost to anyone to not doing CCS because there's no price on carbon and no penalty for emitting carbon, then the economics can only take you so far with the tax credit. So I think that's a real question of, it's very clear to me why you do demonstration and you start down this path. It's not obvious to me what the model is where that gets scaled up to the level that you really need to scale up, and what the economic and commercial sort of rationale is and how you do that, or whether you just make that as part of the cost of doing business, and whether that is an acceptable answer to this question.
I mean, if I could jump in, you may see something through carbon border adjustment mechanisms that begin to start encouraging this. It's a natural for oil and gas producers for a couple of reasons, or for fossil fuel producers in general for a couple of reasons. I mean, Nikos definitely captured a lot of those reasons, but there's there's a parasitic load associated with CCS. It takes a lot of energy to capture the carbon, then compress it, and then pump it through pipelines and put it back underground, right? And yes, their expertise is useful for that, but you also need to burn 15 to 30% more fuel to do this, right? So and that's where some of the questions around blue hydrogen come. There's a pretty interesting paper, How Green is Blue Hydrogen, where the researchers basically accounted for all of that process. So not just the making of hydrogen from natural gas, but also the capture of the CCS and the compression. So the capture of the carbon and the compression and pumping that underground, and all the different basing that on natural gas as well. When you combine all of those processes and you factor in a certain amount of methane leakage through that whole thing, well, actually, depending on what your methane leakage number is, I think they use 3.5%, pretty high number. That was it turned out to be not a great investment, right? If you're trying to reduce carbon, but in the Middle East, their methane leakage, may not be as high as it is here, and actually, it may not even be that high here. So it might, there are probably some good arguments for it. And if you can sell that LNG or your oil, if you can use the CCS to get a premium, if you can sort of tie it to your exports for some markets and get a better price for it, that might help finance it as well. So carbon taxation or just a border adjustment mechanism that allows you to get a premium for those cargoes could also help.
I mean, if I may add 2 thoughts on that. I think, one of the concepts of decarbonization is that you try to electrify as much as you can, but at some point you are hitting a barrier. I mean, you can't electrify absolutely everything. And this is where, other things, using CCS and, using molecules might actually come handy. And this is where, using natural gas with CCS or producing blue hydrogen comes in. So, there are a lot of discussions on really how much Storage is available depending on the region, whether it makes sense, how it's going to be financed, and why, the industry has not invested more because the technology has been around for quite some time. I mean, there have been all these discussions, but at the end of the day, this is about how are we going to meet these ultimate targets if there is no CCS. And usually, if you are looking at different studies, you may find out that the cost could be much higher.
Yeah, indeed. I think, look, the studies of decarbonisation paths in general show the more diverse the path, the more options you have, the easier and cheaper it's going to be. Still recognising that all this decarbonisation is a huge challenge. I think the path of decarbonisation in the Middle East will be very interesting, just because it will follow quite a different model. Economically, technically, but also very much politically from the European path and perhaps other paths around the world. And in some respects, maybe a valuable example if it's done well. But the panel raises the questions of what is going to drive this decarbonisation. Yes, the UAE has a net zero goal. Perhaps other countries will join that. But what policies and how much political impetus will actually be within the domestic economy? How much pain will leadership of these countries be willing to take? How much will they be prepared to go up against vested interests and legacy businesses in order to push decarbonisation, even when it's sometimes uncomfortable? Of course, we see that the same debate in different ways playing out around the world, in Europe, in China, in North America as well. I think we're approaching the end, but there's one further area which has been attracting a lot of attention, and we have touched on it several times, and that's hydrogen. We've talked a bit in general about how the role hydrogen could play in the Middle East as a decarbonisation method domestically, as an export product, whether actually as hydrogen itself or derivatives. I'd like to go a little bit more granular on that in response to one of the audience questions. We've seen hydrogen projects and strategies announced in several countries. So the UAE and also Dubai separately have hydrogen strategies. We've seen hydrogen projects, blue and green, announced in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, Egypt. And if we go over into North Africa, also in Morocco, even in Mauritania. So quite a range of projects. You can give these different levels of viability and reality. But what I'd like to hear, what are the panel's thoughts about the advantages and disadvantages that the region has as a hydrogen exporter, but also within the region? Which countries would you pick out as likely to be leaders or success stories in hydrogen, or others that maybe will fall short?
I mean, it goes back a little bit to what we were saying before. I mean, are these countries looking uniquely at exporting hydrogen, in which case, as I mentioned, I mean, the market may be a little bit more limited, because the problem with hydrogen is that domestically produced hydrogen, whether it's based on natural gas or on renewable, I mean, in a certain point in time, maybe not now, but in the 2030s, 2040s, the cost of production is going to be low, depending on the cost of carbon in those regions. So, I mean, are imports going to be competitive? That's really the key question. And the problem with hydrogen is that it's costing a lot to transport across seas. I mean, it's different when you are looking at a pipeline. But the geographies that we are looking at are, Japan, Korea, and such. So it's going to be across the seas. And therefore, we are looking at several dollars per kilogram to transport this hydrogen, whatever the method is going to be. And there is no agreement on the method. So that's really one key question. Are you looking only at exporting hydrogen, or are you also looking at using hydrogen to decarbonize your own demand, whether it's for the production of fertilizer, whether this is in industry, potentially in shipping or in heavy duty transport?
I mean, it seems to me that there's a pretty good argument for it in Middle Eastern countries that have lots of cheap solar availability and cheap land, or good natural gas resources and geological storage. So lots of countries over there have these attributes, or Oman with all its wind, right? So, or sort of Northwest Saudi Arabia also has pretty good wind resource. Of course, these countries like it because it uses oil and gas infrastructure. It uses existing pipelines. They just need to be, modified a little bit. I read somewhere that the cost of modifying a pipeline is for hydrogen from natural gas is about 10% of the cost of building a new pipeline. So it's and if you've got an existing pipeline that can be repurposed as a hydrogen pipe for hydrogen, like say, for example, North African countries that might export, might switch over their pipelines to Southern Europe, that run under the Mediterranean, or they can just make some hydrogen and start, including that in their, sort of diluting the methane intensity with hydrogen, and just sort of adding that to their to the mix of that they export. That could be a, even the internal combustion engine can use it. So, and it's a fuel, right? It's not like the renewables that are getting their using the sun and wind, or as I spoke about in my opening remarks, where there's it reduces trade in commodities. This is something that continues that pre-existing commodity trade that those countries are so hooked on, and those regimes need for the way they govern their countries. They need those rents that based on continued exports of combustible fuel. So this is something that fits that model really well. I could see those regimes being pretty comfortable, a lot more comfortable with moving to hydrogen, converting some existing infrastructure, and trying to push, even in Glasgow for that. So I would be, fairly bullish on it, from those, structural standpoints.
If I can just add one quick thing, when you think about the cost of hydrogen, right? It's the cost of, the hydrogen production, and then the input, whether it's electricity or gas, and then the load factor, like how much you use the facility. So when I think of the region, it no longer really has cheap gas. We're kind of like past that point. It may have great renewable energy resources, but if you think about solar, solar is not great for hydrogen on its own because the load factor is not very high. And so I think you really have to ask yourself, do you have enough of a diversified mix, or are you going to be doing gas that is no longer cheap, then CCS, then hydrogen? And as Anne-Sophie said, and as I said before, it's not obvious that the price differentials or the cost differentials are such to support a long haul trade in hydrogen. If you're thinking of it from an export perspective, I think there's a real questions about what this thing is going to look like and whether the Middle East has a huge competitive advantage, and which countries in the Middle East have that competitive advantage. And then on the domestic front, I think it's, it comes back to, why is anyone that is using gas today going to switch to hydrogen absent a regulatory or market signal that tells them to switch? It's a question I have for the US. It's a question I have for lots of other places. It's not a unique to the Middle East question, but I think it does raise, similar to the CCS, is if you're trying to get people to switch, what are the mechanisms that you're going to get them to switch? And at this point for hydrogen, they're not quite there yet. So we're in the experimentation phase, and that's great because you have to experiment and test things out, but it's too soon to see how this plays out.
Well, thanks to all our panel. We've hit our time for now. So, but an excellent, very wide-ranging discussion. I hope for the audience that we're able to address all of your questions. Also touching on some of these key points on the impact of the geopolitical impact, the impact of the current energy squeeze, the potential for decarbonisation in the Middle East, and how that affects its global position as an energy supplier, the impact of hydrogen and CCS, and the impact on the domestic political economy of Middle East countries as when and if they do decarbonise. So a very wide-ranging discussion. Appreciate everybody's contributions, and Raymond, I'll just hand back to you for a couple of closing comments.
Thanks, Robin, for an excellent job moderating the session, and to our speakers for joining us, giving us their time and sharing their amazing insights with us. Thank you all again also for joining us. And remember to join us tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern time for the third and final session of this year's Petro Diplomacy Conference with a focus on geopolitics and the future of the OPEC Plus alliance. The video from today should be posted in the next couple of days on our website, agsiw.org. So please be on the lookout and make sure to check the website for updates, both on the conference and publications going forward. Again, thank you all for joining us, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye-bye.